moving cars. You would find him in his office, surrounded by junior executives with the phones jangling, 3 people waiting to get a little bit of his time for an executive decision. That was his working day. That's the kind of criminal he was. In other words, he was a modern criminal.
1927 started as a good year for Al by all measures. The U.S. Attorney's Office would estimate his organization took in $105 million that year, all from unlawful enterprises. One of his allies, Big Bill Thompson, was voted back in as mayor of Chicago, giving control of the city, in effect, to Capone. When things were going his way, Al tried to relax. He took his son to baseball games. He boxed. He liked to have a good time. Capone said he was tired of being underappreciated in his role as public servant, that he needed a getaway. So he bought one. In January 1928, Capone paid $40,000 in cash for a 14-room mansion on Palm Island, Florida, near Miami. He invested another $100,000 in improvements to make it a paradise. Still, this wouldn't shelter Capone from problems starting to brew in his own organization. Al learned that his favorite New York hitman, Frankie Yale, was stealing East Coast booze shipments. Loyalty was paramount to Capone, and he felt betrayed. Yale had killed often for Capone. Now the tables were turned. On July 1st, 1928, Yale was the victim, chased and shot down in New York by Al's gunmen. Capone still had one significant rival, Bugs Moran. Moran's gang was hijacking the mob's whiskey. Capone was fed up with Moran's antics, and at the end of December, he went to Florida to mastermind what would become his most infamous crime.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was one of the most fascinating and complicated hits in the history of gangland in this country, probably also the most celebrated.
On the morning of February 14th, 1929, Moran was late getting to his warehouse. His men were there waiting for a shipment of whiskey. Strangers walked in, 2 dressed as cops, 2 others in plain clothes. Moran's men, thinking it was a raid, put their hands up, turned and faced the wall, and instantly were mowed down. An inquest was assembled to investigate. Moran and others pointed the finger at Capone, but Al had an airtight alibi. He was in Florida in a meeting with the district attorney in Miami at the time of the shootings. Once again, with no one willing to testify, the case was closed.
No one knows for sure who did it. My theory is they thought the last person to go in, who looked quite a bit like Moran and was wearing the same outfit that Moran wore, a light overcoat with a darker brown fedora. I think they thought he was Moran.
The city and the country was sickened by this killing, but the bloodshed wasn't over. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the most graphic show of violence yet. Now, there was no escape for Capone. He was to become the target of criminals and lawmen alike. Public disgust with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre had barely subsided when Al Capone made his next move to clean house. In May 1929, Al's informants told him hitmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmi and another gunman were conspiring to murder him. Capone invited them to a roadhouse in Indiana.
He got their confidence and threw a banquet for them, and they had a wonderful evening drinking and eating, and then at the end of the night, then the tables turned and he accused them of treachery, and he and his bodyguards beat him to death with baseball bats, before shooting him, of course.
I photographed the 3 bodies that were found in the brushes in Hammond. Their heads were smashed. They were bad. The police picked up the bodies and they took them to a mortuary, and we had taken pictures of them covered up. You only show a little bit of their face.
It was a really hideous crime. In fact, it was so hideous that even other gangsters began to distance themselves from Capone at that time.
Suddenly, trouble was everywhere for Capone. Public sentiment against him was growing. His life was in danger. There was a $50,000 contract out on him. Al figured the only place he'd be safe was in a jail, away from Chicago. So he set it up. On May 16th, leaving a movie theater in Philadelphia, Capone and his bodyguard were arrested for carrying concealed weapons. The scheme went haywire when the judge threw the book at them. The verdict was stiff: a year in jail. Al tried everything to get out early. from bribery to giving money to local charities at Christmas. It didn't work. So Al used his phone privileges to run his gang, long distance from jail. The news he got from home was bad. Capone and his organization were now a target of the federal government. President Hoover wanted to see Big Al behind bars for a long time. He kept asking his aides, "Have you got that fellow Capone yet?" The IRS was working on it, closing in on his gang.
While he was still in jail in Philadelphia, Ralph Capone was gotten and was sent away. Jack Guzik was sent away. Frank Nitti, who was Capone's number 2, was sent away, all on income tax.
When Capone left prison in March 1930, new problems awaited him. He had just been named public enemy number 1 by the Chicago Crime Commission. But he wanted people to think of him as a good guy. The country was entering the Depression, so Capone responded, opening Chicago's first soup kitchen, feeding 3,000 hungry people a day.
It wasn't for our friend Al Capone rotting up in this here White House on 935 South State Street, where he wouldn't eat.
Capone's generosity made him somewhat of a folk hero in the media. But in June, Al lost one of his major pipelines to the press. Jake Lingle, who covered crime and politics for the Chicago Tribune and was on Capone's payroll, was gunned down by one of Al's rivals.
When I looked at him, I said, "Oh my God, that's Jake." Well, I took a picture too and then called the office. I said, "Jake Lingle was just killed. He was on his way to the racetrack, and the only reason I know that is because he had a racing farm near him."
Capone avenged Lingle's death and began to deal with his newest enemy, the federal government. Pop culture has left the impression that a group of Prohibition agents shut down Capone. The Untouchables, led by Elliot Ness, in reality, did little more than stage a couple of raids for the press. The IRS taxmen, who had already put away Capone's top lieutenants, were the government's real heroes. But it wasn't easy. Legally, Al didn't own a thing.
He couldn't buy real estate. He put his house in Florida in his wife's name. He put his house in Chicago in his mother's name. He put his car in his wife's name. He didn't keep ledgers, but some of his bookkeepers kept ledgers. And eventually the IRS discovered the ledgers, was able to decipher the ledgers, and was able to track some of the codes in the ledgers to Capone's old bookkeepers and then track them back to Capone himself.
It took 5 years to bring all the evidence together. On June 5th, 1931, the man known as Alphonse Capone was indicted on 22 counts of income tax evasion dating from 1925 through 1929. The prosecution, led by United States Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, said Capone owed Uncle Sam just over $215,000. Capone did everything in his power to control the outcome of this case.
Capone hired 5 hoodlums to come out here from New York to kill my father. And they were spotted here, and the Secret Service had tailed them enough to stop this, and Capone was convinced you better send them home. This was just before the trial. We had a squad car, a Chicago squad car in front of our house on the south side of Chicago, and one in the back part of the house, and my father had Secret Service with him all the time doing this thing, but it's the only way to keep him alive.
Capone tried to plea bargain, but the judge wouldn't hear of it. Then Capone opened his wallet to buy off the jury. But when the judge found out, he switched jurors moments before the trial was set to begin on October 7th. There was no real defense for Capone. With so many hard-working Americans paying taxes on small salaries and so many out of work, there wasn't much sympathy for Big Al, the big spender.
The jury was out 9 hours. There were 22 ballots taken. And as we know by history that Al Capone was found guilty of income tax evasion. Not murder, not pimping, not all the dirty things he did or killing, but income tax. But that was the only way he could be prosecuted, and that's what my father did.
Capone was sentenced to 11 years behind bars, the stiffest penalty of any tax case to date.
It's safe to assume that Capone never expected to be convicted, or if he was convicted, he expected to spend perhaps a year or 2 in jail, not 10 or 11 years.
As he left court, he looked to the photographers and said, "Get enough, boys. You won't be seeing me for a long time." Capone appealed the verdict, but lost. and went from Chicago's Cook County Jail to federal prison in Atlanta. In August 1934, he was sent to the Rock, Alcatraz. At Alcatraz, Capone kept to himself. His old ways didn't work there. In 1936, a fellow prisoner tried to kill him, stabbing Capone in the back with a pair of scissors. In 1938, Al was officially diagnosed as suffering the degenerative effects of syphilis, picked up from one of his prostitute girlfriends. His mind was going. Capone needed medical treatment, and in January 1939, he was transferred to the Federal Correctional Center outside Los Angeles. In November, he was released from prison and sent to Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore. Al returned to Florida in March 1940. Syphilis ate away at Capone for the rest of his life. At age 48, on January 25, 1947, Alphonse Capone died of cardiac arrest. His body was taken to Chicago for burial.
Well, it was a very cold day in January of 1947. In fact, it was 11 below zero at the time. It was a huge funeral because hundreds of persons turned out. There was an edict by Anthony J. Accardo, who was the boss of the mob and had been a former bodyguard for Al Capone, to all crime syndicate gangsters to show up at the funeral and pay their respects to Al Capone, even though Al Capone had no power and was helpless when he died.
Capone's run as a mob kingpin was over, but his fingerprints on crime and Chicago's reputation lives on.
There's no doubt but that the Capone era established the underpinnings of what is now the Chicago organized crime family. It gave the mob, a start here in the Windy City. And that beginning led to a zenith in activity in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. There was and continues to be in some form an alliance between the hoodlums that began under Capone and elected public officials.
Chicago can't shake its link with the big fellow. In 1993, a tourist attraction paying homage to him opened. His legend lives on.
I'm Big Al, AC, Alphonse Capone.
My father made many speeches and made this point about Al Capone upon numerous occasions, that had this man taken all his energy, talent, and basic intelligence and guts, if you will, and directed this energy down legitimate avenues, he'd been a very successful businessman. There's no doubt about it. He had a peculiar charm about him that he could use when he wanted to use, and this, of course, was deceptive. But as we all know, he didn't use his talents in that direction, and as a result, people died, people were hurt, and Chicago lost its reputation.
Of course, Capone is world famous. Wherever you go, if you mention Chicago, people instantly associate that city with Capone.
There are lots of celebrities. Very, very few of them become allusions. So their name means the same thing to everyone who hears it. Capone was one.
He never impressed me of anything except that he was a bad guy. And the reason maybe that I felt that way is because I happen to be an Italian. And anybody that hurts an Italian person, I feel hurt. And so, let's end this. To me, he was a bum.
In 1933, a Chicago entrepreneur decided to cash in on Al Capone's legend. He opened a museum called Capone's Chicago. Tourists could buy T-shirts with Capone's likeness or watch a reenactment of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It's only recently that Capone's Chicago went out of business. And that closing delighted many Chicagoans who felt the museum glorified a brutal man who symbolized the